And hello there, everyone on the YouTubes. I hope all of you are well, and welcome to the brand new reading for the Quarantine Collective of Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, Pierre Klossowski's what I consider to be a masterpiece. It's a hell of a book. I've been wanting to go over this for some time. I first picked this up about 2 years ago. We got into Klossowski very early in our readings. We did Baphomet, we did some of his more prosaic literature sort of readings. And then I stepped away, and I have found myself, ever since repicking this back up, Living Currency, good, very short, but very good, pushing me towards this. And when I saw Daniel Smith did a translation, I dove even further. I picked up the French about a year ago, and since then it has fully mutated my understanding, not just of Nietzsche, but of Deleuze, actually, because as you'll see as we go through, there's a lot of unspoken friendships happening here. I mean, he dedicates other pieces to Deleuze. They obviously had just a significant number of conversations, and it's going to be really fun. So I'm jazzed to get into it. We're going to go through first the introduction. That may be what we end up spending a decent amount on today. I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as possible because I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining the explanations. But without further ado, we'll just jump straight in. The thing that is worth noting as I go through here, Klossowski, we'll say, has a very unique writing style. Deleuze does this too. You see this, I think, in a lot of critical theory, or what they call continental philosophers or whatever, where the writing is less on the hyperanalytic, ultra-logical, drawn-out side, and more conversational, more asking and answering questions, things like that. Klossowski, I think, takes that even further, and it makes it very fun to read. We're going to be going through a couple things. We're not going to be going through Daniel Smith's introduction. We will be coming back to it. don't worry. Daniel Smith writes just a huge fucking foreword where he goes through how Klossowski defines words and uses words. We're going to be using that. We're going to be referencing it kind of constantly throughout the rest of the work. So we're not going to be going through that. It's a little dry to just read. But as we're going through the introduction here, be understanding Klossowski is basically saying, hey, I'm not going to be paying attention to Nietzsche scholarship. Hey, I'm not reading it the way anyone else is doing it. Hey, this is going to be weird. And that's what I think makes it awesome. So it's appreciated, and we'll make our way through. The text is a little fucked up. Let me really quick fix that. 1 second. I have a really funky filter that I just need to clean up a little bit. Boop, 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 boop. Sorry, everyone, just 2 seconds. Apologies. Yeah, that should be all right. Hopefully everyone can read it. If you can't, let me know. I'll find a way to get this working out. But with that, let's go ahead and dive on in. This is a book that will exhibit an unusual ignorance. How can we speak solely of Nietzsche's thought without taking into account everything that has subsequently been said about it? Will we not thereby run the risk of following paths that have already been traveled more than once, blazing trails that have been marked out many times, imprudently asking questions that have been long ago left behind? Will we not in this way reveal a negligence, a total lack of scruples with regard to the meticulous exegesis that recently have been written, in order to interpret, as so many signals, the flashes of summer lightning that a destiny continues to send our way from the horizon of our century? What then is our aim, if indeed we have one? Let us say that we have written a false study, because we are reading Nietzsche's text directly, because we are listening to him speak. Can we perhaps make him speak to us? Can we ourselves make use of the whisperings, the breathing, the bursts of anger and laughter, in what may be the most ingratiating and also the most irritating prose yet written in the German language? For those who can hear it, the word of Nietzsche gains a power that is all the more explosive insofar as contemporary history, current events, and the universe are beginning to answer, in a more or less circuitous manner, the questions Nietzsche was asking some 80 years ago. Nietzsche was interrogating the near and distant future, a future that has now become our everyday reality, and he predicted that this future would be convulsive, to the point where our own convulsions are caricatures of his thought. We will try to comprehend how and in what sense Nietzsche's interrogation describes what we are now living through. I love the phrasing here. It's so good. Jeremy on YouTube, the videos are going to be up forever, so enjoy that. We have a lot of PDFs. If you want to jump into the DGQC, discord.gg/DGQC, let me actually make sure that we have my preferred one up here, because I just have a Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle. Is that the right one? No, that's the different one. I have like four fucking PDFs. It took forever to find. 2 seconds and I'll continue to ramble. There. It's in the voice chat here. Nietzsche, when he was writing, and he talked about this as he wrote, having Klossowski sort of bring that back is kind of awesome. Regardless of whatever anyone else was going to ever write about Nietzsche, Nietzsche sort of created these really interesting philosophical weapons that were sort of set in time to go off. He was able to understand what would happen as we lost the sort of Christian God set up, as we became quote unquote modern, as he talked about it, or as we moved towards a very different type of nihilism. And the way Nietzsche talked about it it's very easy to see how it sort of has happened, how things have come true, how he sort of had these little time capsules waiting for us. And that's what he's talking about here. But the phrasing he uses, I love. And he predicted this future would be convulsive, to the point where our own convulsions are caricatures of his thought. Klossowski is very good with words. He's just very, very good with words. The forces and how they're making us work and how things work, effectively, yes, made Nietzsche almost prophetic. But again, not prophetic, just understanding how these things go together. And Nietzsche's interrogation of these forces and of these systems is what we're living through. And here is where you can start to see the beginning, the next couple of paragraphs, the complete divergence that he's going to be making from, I think, all of Nietzsche's scholarship. We must not overlook two essential points that have hitherto remained veiled, if not passed over in silence, in the study of his thought. The first is that as Nietzsche's thought unfolded, it abandoned the strictly speculative realm in order to adopt, if not simulate, the preliminary elements of a conspiracy. It thereby made our own era the object of a tacit accusation. The indictment had been handed down by the Marxist exegesis, which had at least exposed the intention of the conspiracy, since every individual thought of bourgeois origin necessarily reveals its complicity in a class conspiracy. But there is a Nietzschean conspiracy, which is not that of a class, but that of an isolated individual, like Sade, who uses the means of this class not only against his own class, but also against the existing forms of the human species as a whole. That's the first thing. I want to make sure, just so no one's super confused here, he's not saying like political conspiracy or conspiracy theory shit. That is not the phrasing. He's using it here. It is non-literal. He's more speaking towards the idea of this, as I said, sort of the time bombs, a secret preparation, the hidden influences that he's playing, because ultimately these things work to like undermine existing forms of life within culture. And this is what Marxist exegesis talked about, and the intention of the conspiracy, that these things were intended to be built like this. This is how these things operate. And for Marx, it was the class sort of struggle and the class power back and forth. But the underlying thing Nietzsche's doing is a little bit different. It's not that of the class, but of this individual. For Nietzsche, like Sade, who uses this class not only against his own, but against the existing forms of human species as a whole. We'll be getting to that, don't worry. The second point is closely related to the first, because Nietzsche's thought meditated on a lived experience to the point where it became inverted into a systematic premeditation, prey to an interpretive delirium that seemed to diminish the responsibility of the thinker. There is a tendency to grant it, as it were, extenuating circumstances, which is worse than the Marxist indictment. For what do we want to extenuate? The fact that his thought revolved around delirium as its axis. Now, early on, Nietzsche was apprehensive about this propensity in himself, and his every effort was directed towards fighting the irresistible attraction that chaos, or more precisely, the chasm, or the void, exerted on him, a hiatus which, starting in his childhood, he strove to fill in and cross over through his autobiography. The more he probed the phenomenon of thought and the different behaviors that result from it, the more he studied the individual reactions provoked by the structures of the modern world, and always in relation to his conception of the ancient world, the closer he drew to this chasm. So really, there's a second bit, and this is what Klossowski is going to be drawing out through all of this. As we talk about and have talked about sort of the immanent, or the way these things work within Deleuze, one of the things a lot of people mistake about Deleuze is that Deleuze is like, fuck representation. I've actually had this conversation just in the last week. Hey, Brooks, Nietzsche cannot be interpreted in the left. Of course he can. I mean, depends on what you mean, but his work's exceptionally emancipatory and anti-imperial, and yeah, sure. I've had this conversation. Deleuze was not anti-representation. Instead, it was about how these things work together, and that there is actually power in what Deleuze would call, and what Klossowski called, the simulacra. These things that are ideas without origin, or that are copies without the original, that somehow are detached. There's actual power here. There's use here. And we need to understand that. Because instead of considering that these things come first and desire follows, we must consider that desires first and these things follow. It's about subordinating representation, desire, delirium to desire, which means that those elements are actually powerful for us. There's a thing he's playing with here as he's talking about the delirium, Nietzsche's pathology as he talks about it, and he does throughout. And Klossowski in this book is going to be spending a lot of time talking about the high tonalities of the soul early on, and later on the simulacra, later on the phantasm. These things are going to be a big deal because for Nietzsche, he saw these things as a delirious interpretation, as he said, as Klossowski says it. And this thing that he's playing with is very different. To continue this and just finish this paragraph, lucid thought, delirium, and the conspiracy form an indissoluble whole in Nietzsche, an indissolubility that would become the criterion for discerning what is of consequence or not. This does not mean that since it involved delirium, Nietzsche's thought was pathological. Rather, because his thought was lucid to the extreme, it took on the appearance of a delirious interpretation, and also required the entire experimental initiative of the modern world. It is modernity that must now be charged with determining whether this initiative has failed or succeeded. But because the world is itself concerned with Nietzsche's initiative, the more the modern world experiences the threat of its own failures, the more Nietzsche's thought gains in stature. Modern catastrophes are always confused, in the more or less short term, with the good news of a false prophet. This is Klossowski laying out everything he's going to be arguing. But again, the way that Nietzsche played, when you read Nietzsche, and I think if anyone's read all of Nietzsche, oh, the PDF did not download. Oh, fuck, really? 1 second. God damn it. It might not be the right PDF. You're right. It might be the wrong PDF. Sorry, 1 second. Try this guy, August. And it didn't send it. Why didn't it send it? Try this one. Let's see. Yeah, this is the one I'm using right now. So it's not my single page one, but this is the one I'm using that we're actually reading. To go back. Sorry. Having to keep all of this going. But if you've read all of Nietzsche, there is this odd thing that I found haunting me as I read. Nietzsche kind of goes between what seems like a spiritual or delirious, weird, metaphorical world, and he does, but also he's like hyper rational, and he really is trying to sort of do both, but it's actually not that he's doing both. Klossowski's here talking about taking it a different way. What if instead of that, instead of thinking of it as trying to do both or how they're separating or any of that, what if it's precisely the inseparability of the rational analysis on one side and this cultural subversion or madness on the other? This flows with Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche and philosophy, but this is kind of the idea that Klossowski's starting us off with. The madness, the cultural subversion, and the rational analysis together is kind of Nietzsche's epistemological filter. It is this idea that ideas have weight when they integrate all three for Nietzsche. They have all three in them. So instead of the idea of challenging traditional philosophy by just being reasonable or playing with reason, the ability for us to instead go, well, actually, what if we also have unreason? Yeah, unreason. So it's not actually this weird biographical side story that Nietzsche was doing all this, but what if actually we take him as a whole? What if we take him as the multiplicity and the things impacting each other and how these forces interacted with each other, and actually take not the madness as this side story, but instead part and parcel of the entire thing? That is effectively what Klossowski's saying here. And it's a radically different way to handle this. This follows, Deleuze mentions this and talks about how these things aren't really separable, but Klossowski is running with it. He's running with it. Because again, this does not mean that since it involved delirium, Nietzsche's thought was pathological. Rather, his thought was lucid. It took on the appearance of delirious interpretation and also required the entire experimental initiative of the modern world. All of these things layered together. Yes, Morty, Apollo and Dionysus. It's a very different reading of Nietzsche, if you can't tell already. It's a very different reading of Nietzsche. And it's triadic too. It would be Apollo, Dionysus, and sorry, who would go well in there? My brain's not working for it, but that works. Yeah, I mean, again, this is not saying the delirium contaminates, which is how other people have written. Again, not Deleuze. So it's why I like this. This does dovetail very nicely with Deleuze's reading, but it's a necessity. It's there by necessity. The madness is there by necessity. Lucidity about these modern contradictions gives insights so radical that it seems to contravene normality. Is that making sense? Because it's genuinely like a fucking wild way to talk about this shit.
You mean that delirium is part of rationalism? Like it's part of the modes of rationalism?
So,
right?
So delirium specifically, I want to be very specific about the usage of these terms, because for Klossowski, these have very particular meanings, and I want to get it just right. 2 seconds. Because delirium here it's not identical to what Deleuze or others will be using for the term. So hold on for just 2 seconds. Sorry, 1 sec. I need to find the part in the opening. Well, you know what? I'm actually going to say we'll get to it. I'm going to say we'll get to it because the definition ends up impinging on other shit. That's literally what I don't want to do. So delirium is shared narrative stories or things that aren't necessarily directly in thought or material. They're in Anti-Oedipus, they use the term delirium in the same way, where they talk about this element. So it's playing with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like the logic of sense, Lewis Carroll, right? Yes. Playing with these kind of esoteric words and like foaming and exactly. Okay.
Yeah, it's quite literally that sense and nonsense, or reason and unreason is going to be exactly. Like these things go together, and these things landed right around the same time. So, and they kind of dedicated things to each other, and Klossowski is featured throughout Logic of Sense. Like you start to see a lot more shit where you're like, oh, this is where all this stuff came together. Fuck me. Okay. So we have all this, and we have this odd way that he wants us to look at Nietzsche's works as a totality, which is, again, more often than not, when you're reading what someone's saying about Nietzsche, they'll mention the madness as a side thing. They'll be like, oh, and he later cracked on. Some people will say that it's because of his works. And it's like, that's not what he's saying here either. He's saying that necessarily all of these things came together. So then the question is, What then is the act of thinking? There was a suspicion lurking silently in the writings of Nietzsche's youth, which came to the fore in an increasingly virulent way in the unpublished fragments contemporaneous to human, all too human, and especially the gay science. What is lucid and what is unconscious in our thought and our actions? A subterranean question that disguised itself outwardly in a critique of culture and that intentionally made itself explicit in a form that could still be integrated into the speculative and historical discussions of his time. Nietzsche's thought thus followed, in an absolutely simultaneous manner, two divergent movements. The notion of lucidity was valid only to the degree that total obscurity continued to be envisioned, and thus affirmed. This is a quote. At every moment, chaos is still pursuing its work in our mind. Concepts, images, feelings are there, juxtaposed fortuitously, thrown together pell-mell. In this way, relations that astonish the mind are created. The mind recalls something similar. It feels a flavor. It retains and elaborates both according to its art and its knowledge. Here is the last small fragment of the world where something new is produced, at least as far as the human eye is concerned. In sum, here again it is a matter of a new chemical combination which as yet has no parallel in the becoming of the world. Nietzsche's fucking great. I really like this. I'm just so you know, I really like this book. Have I not let you know that so far? I should let you know that. I really do like this book a lot. It's very good. So, but to continue, because we'll come back. Don't worry. I just want to continue with finishing his point, because this is where Klossowski is going with it. A thought only rises by falling. It progresses only by regressing. An inconceivable spiral, which to describe as useless is so repugnant to us that we are wary even of admitting that successive generations follow the same movement, even if this means that we associate ourselves with the rise of a mind only as long as it seems to follow in unison with culture, the ascent of history. As for the remainder, we leave the descending movement of this spiraling thought to those who specialize in the failures, the dregs, the waste products produced by the function of thinking and living, experts who, in accordance with this convenient division of labor, hardly need to concern themselves with this tension between lucidity and obscurity, except, perhaps, to note on the day when each reaches a verdict on the other that they had picked up the accent of delirium. I really, really like this shit. Okay. Let me pull up my notes. This is kind of going to be him. This is him sort of previewing like his ideas around all of this. This is basically what he's trying to do. There is a regressive progression rather than a linear advancement in thought, in philosophical development, in the way ideas work, concepts come to be, things come to be. You see some words he uses in there. If you haven't read Living Currency, I highly recommend it. We're going to go, some of that stuff's in here too. And he talks about the waste product, the dregs, the waste products produced by the functions of thinking and living. There is, as things go, the reality of as these things happen, there is always waste product. We kind of forget about it. We kind of toss it aside. We don't consider waste product a part of anything, but it is. It's very much normal of all of this. The specialists he's talking about here specifically are like people who do cultural analysis, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, whatever it may be, who treat regression as a symptom rather than something that actually constitutes the functioning of things. And so because of that, we kind of throw the idea of that thing, the regression, the return, the waste products, the failures, we disavow it as existing, but it's necessary, and it's actually built into the very act of creation itself. There's a thing he talks about, and I'm very much paraphrasing from Living Currency, that I really love the idea of. We don't talk about the cost of building a factory in the sense of all of the R&D and setup and tests and trials and failures that go into building it. We tend to think that a factory is just appears and makes toys. But if you haven't been involved with it, like toy making, I had to get involved. It was a weird thing the first time in my career, like actually seeing how tooling worked and the back and forth, and the 6 to 9 fucking months, if not longer, to make the shittiest, cheap little plastic toys, because all of these things and all of this product is just thrown out. It's remelted down, or it's recycled, or just put in the landfill. And that includes machinery, that includes parts. That's not just the failures of the dolls, because you have to chuck the whole fucking thing out the window if it doesn't work. So all of this, though, we don't consider. And this is the regression that is part of that. Again, this is going to become important as he talks about it, but the descending movement, as he's talking about here, the falling that is opposite to rising, these things, as he's sort of talking about, it is disavowed. Because of this, we have a sanitized, cultural acceptable version of everything that naturally domesticates truly radical thought, because it's always aligned with the progress of history. We forget the nature of how all of these things had to waste a fuck ton. Is this taken from Bataille? This is touching into Bataille. Bataille hit on all of this, but like, I think he's focusing a lot more on the literal waste of the process, which Bataille doesn't spend as much time in Accursed Cheer going on about, because it's up front for him, and it's in everything. The nature of doing anything interesting necessitates a regression that we forget about as we move forward. We regress, we move forward. This thing, the remainder, we leave the descending movement of the spiraling thought to those who specialize in failures. We toss it aside and we sanitize the entire process. And this is what he's talking about with Nietzsche. We've done the same thing with Nietzsche. We've forgotten that the radicality of his thought can't be extracted from his madness, can't be extracted from the life he led, can't be extracted from anything. You have to bring all of this. And all of these things coming together changes how we consider them. In fact, it makes us realize the actual process of real production, and by doing so, brings us closer to understanding not just how things are produced and how we're produced, but being able to see that process without the sanitized, de-radicalized version. Extracted here means extricated, slightly different, but it's close enough, I think. We're in the intro. He's going to be going through all of this so much. To continue, to want to detect this accent in Nietzsche's thought would, from the outset, require us to consult the very authorities that his thought called into question. Either Nietzsche was delirious from the outset in even wanting to attack these authorities, or else he was clear-sighted in attacking the very notion of lucidity directly. This is why, at every step, Nietzsche's thought found itself circumscribed. On the inside, by the principle of identity on which language, the code of everyday signs, depends in accordance with the reality principle, and again, on the outside, by competent institutional authorities. The historians of philosophy. These are the experts who deal with the waste, as he mentioned a moment ago. But also, and above all, by the psychiatrists, the surveyors of the unconscious who, for this very reason, control the more or less variable range of the reality principle, to which the person who thinks or acts would bear witness. Finally, on both sides, by science and its experiments, which sometimes separates and sometimes brings the two together, thus displacing the boundaries and adjusting the demarcations between the inside and the outside. this is basically, hey, I'm not going to talk about anyone who's ever interpreted Nietzsche because here's how they suck at it. That's basically like more or less this is the damage that has been done to Nietzschean thought over time. It's been attacked and circumscribed in every way and de-radicalized and denatured and turned into fascist pablum on the inside, one by the principle of identity, on which language depends, according to the reality principle. That's the inside, as he's sort of phrasing it. The idea of A equals A, the Aristotelian sort of idea of identity. And what that does is it structures communication and philosophical discourse overall. So it basically keeps stable referential relationships there. But Nietzsche doesn't do that. Like on the inside, that's what he's saying. On the inside, basically he's being betrayed by those who would share his thought, because what they're doing on the inside is they're starting with language and they're doing it according to the reality principle. Any critique of identity necessarily has to use language presupposing identity, which makes a performative contradiction and completely neutralizes Nietzsche's core critique. On the inside, that's, again, Klossowski's kind of fucking wild, and it's a lot. We're going to get into all these, don't worry. But on the outside, and this is, I think, the one that's a little bit more clear to sort of see, the competent institutional authorities, historians, and above all, psychiatrists, surveyors of the unconscious. So you have this weird outside thing where the institutional discourse that exists claims competence over rational thought on the one side and irrational thought as well, but separates them. And the psychiatrists basically become the surveyors. Oh, this is what he truly meant. Here's what these things mean symbolically. Here's blah, 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 all of this stuff. This thing creates the boundaries of what is allowed rational discourse because it manages the irrational. And these people then ultimately control the reality principle, which is what destroys it from the inside. Right? This is how I read. I've got too many notes on this book. This is how I read this paragraph and this setup, because it closes, and I think the closing is the telling moment that sort of slides it together, because you end up with being circumscribed on both sides. The inside, the outside, and on both sides by science and its experimentations. Sometimes separates, sometimes brings the two together, displacing boundaries and adjusting demarcations. So you have this, on top of all that, this weird meta-authority, which is keeping that weird dichotomy of the internal and the external, the linguistic logical to the institutional medical, the bodily versus the mental. These things and how they're set up, the experimentation that they're referring to isn't about discovering truth, but instead fucking with these boundaries. And Nietzsche identified this. He talked about this. The use of adjusting the demarcations, and there's quotes blah, 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 like it's bad, is because it's not really neutral. It's adjusting. It's serving power. It's serving truth, in quotes, as you might say. So Nietzsche's been done dirty by everybody. Like I said, it's a really interesting reading of Nietzsche. I think it's a fucking really interesting reading of Nietzsche. Before I go on, any questions on that? Does that make sense generally as I'm talking about it? I'm happy to revisit it, use slightly simpler language, not a big deal, but this is like the fun stuff. It's kind of good to keep going. Should have gotten a fucking water before I came out here. All right. As long as Nietzsche respected these variously delimited spheres from the viewpoint of inquiry, his understanding seemed to comply with two principles. The principle of reality, insofar as he described reality historically, he analyzed it in order to reconstruct it, and thus to communicate the results of his research to others. And the principle of identity, insofar as he defined himself as a teacher in relation to what he was teaching. Oh, you just joined. Let me give a mini summary at this point. So Klossowski, we're in the introduction. We haven't really started the book. We're just sort of laying everything out at this point. Klossowski's laying out what he sees as basically how Nietzsche's been done dirty by everyone. Just kind of everybody. And he's laying it out by saying the thing we've done to Nietzsche is we haven't taken Nietzsche qua Nietzsche. Instead, what we've done is we've taken his writing and we've said, hey, this other stuff, this was just his mental incompetence or weirdness. Let's just push that aside. And then we're going to this is really good because this is historical. And he's saying he's a teacher here. Okay, we can listen to that. But this other stuff's kind of weird. So let's put it. So you end up separating Nietzsche into these quadrants instead of bringing them together. And what it does when you separate them is you actually are taking the emancipatory revolutionary potential and castrating it. And he's not wrong. Deleuze makes a very, very similar argument to this, but I don't think he makes it as strongly. This is this book's a masterpiece. Foucault gushed and said it might be the single most important work of philosophy ever written. This is that crazy thing. So it's a hell of a read. So we're making our way through the intro, and then I think we're almost there. Yeah, we just a little bit more. So that's where we're at. Does this get into how and why Nietzsche wrote so aphoristically? No, I'm not going to say yes, because that's not really, I think, what Klossowski is not like, oh, here's why these things are. It's, again, taking Nietzsche qua Nietzsche and taking him for what he wrote directly. An example we're going to get into in chapter 3 very quickly, and I think it's in parts of chapter 1, is Nietzsche spoke of the eternal return being visited during the high tonalities of the soul. And people have broken this down and talked about, oh, well, this is when he was manic. And so you can ignore that thing. It's manic. You don't have to go as crazy with that. And this is actual thinkers have talked about it this way. That's not what Klossowski wants us to do. He wants us to take what Nietzsche wrote and take it as what Nietzsche wrote, qua what Nietzsche wrote. And that is going to be a lot more. It's going to be a lot more. Imagine trying to ignore the eternal return, but still understand Nietzsche. I mean, it's when he says things like what he calls the eternal return, people have talked about it being this big metaphorical thing. I've literally seen YouTube videos, so many fucking YouTube videos that have talked about the eternal return being an aphorism or allegory, that if you had to be stuck doing the same thing every day, what would you do next? And that's what he means, is it's like an Aesop's fable. And it's like, no, it's not. And even more than that, Klossowski, it's hard for me to go back and think of what I used to think the eternal return was after reading this book now. But that's the big deal, is he's like, no, it's a load of shit. That's not what Nietzsche meant. And actually, we need to take what he said for what he said and not psychoanalyze or break things up and neutralize and castrate the entire process. No one has ever stuck doing the same thing every day. Klossowski is way more than that. Klossowski is going to make it way more than that. And I actually think he's right with what, having gone back and reread these parts of Nietzsche, it's hard for me to disagree. Like, it's such a good reading. It's wild. But to continue. But once the demonstration required by institutional language for the teaching of reality was turned into the movement of a declarative mood, the contagious mood or tonality of the soul supplanted the demonstration. Say tonality of the soul, the tonality of the soul. He's just being a little extreme here. He's just being depressive, or he's just being manic. It's fine. We're just going to keep reading and just realize that he's a little bit weird on this. It's okay.
Wouldn't for Nietzsche himself being manic not itself sort of be a kind of philosophy worthy of inquiry?
Hey, that would be kind of the point Klossowski's making. Yes. That's kind of exactly the point Klossowski's making. Yeah. It's exactly, this is why this is, again, Foucault gushed over this. The letter he wrote is crazy. There's a reason people love this book, because it does that. And it's, oh, Nietzsche talked about these things. And I stopped in the middle of a sentence, but that's kind of what this sentence is saying. So I'm going to restart it a little bit. Once the demonstration was turned into the movement of a declarative mood, the contagious mood, tonality of the soul supplanted the demonstration. Nietzsche reached the limit of the principles of identity and reality, which were answerable to the very authorities his own discourse was presumably based upon. Nietzsche introduced into teaching what no authority responsible for the transmission of knowledge, philosophy, had ever been advised to teach. But Nietzsche introduced it surreptitiously, his language, on the contrary, having pushed to an extreme severity the application of the laws required for communication. The tonality of the soul, in making itself thought, was pursuing its own inquiry, to the point where the terms of the latter were reconstituted as a muteness. This thought spoke to itself of an obstacle that the intention to teach would stumble over at the outset. There's a shift in how Nietzsche works, and a lot of people have identified it's the same point, and I think everyone's sort of talked about it, but for Nietzsche, when he shifted from the teaching, which is you can sort of see it in his early work, to this odd change, this break with philological pedagogy as he was existing at the time and as was around. And he became, and that's why I kind of wrote, I didn't want to say like he does talk about why Nietzsche does the aphorism thing, but kind of doesn't, because this is what he's talking about, the change in how Nietzsche wrote, how Nietzsche taught, why Nietzsche did, instead of now transmitting via rational argumentation, which Nietzsche's very early works absolutely were. At this point, it becomes this contagious mood. The phrasing Klossowski uses in the French is the humeur contagieuse, because it's, you have to think of it, mood is a very American and English term that kind of is like the vibes. Think more vibes, contagious vibes, rather than contagious mood. It's vibes, kind of that thing. And so with this contagious humor, the tonality of the soul becomes this philosophical instrument to be used that goes around the rational conviction people have, or the affective transmission that language constitutes. And this completely fucks with how all these people this is where people neutralize Nietzsche. This is the obstacle. This is the thing that he's sort of wanting us to spend an extra moment or two on and think about for the good of Nietzsche, to be frank. Nietzsche is aphoristic as declarative, feels like taking him at his words. In our read-through of Idols, the opening aphorisms are more meaningful when you only understand the context of what he was parroting in his aphorisms and realize he's replacing the old ideas with the new. People definitely do these eisegetical readings of Nietzsche where he must have meant more of what he was teaching against. Like, Fredin, does YouTuber yeah, it's very much that. That's fantastic. It's a great way to put it. Thank you. Yeah, I find it really fascinating. This is where it gets fun, because this is again, this is just the intro. I'm getting animated already. It's a problem. This is going to be a problem for me on this one. I get excited about this book really easy. To continue though, this obstacle, I'm going to start that again. This obstacle, whose muteness was experienced as intensity and resistance, put the aim of teaching itself in question. Now the resistance of the mute obstacle was nothing other than the virtual reaction exerted by the authorities of identity and reality. Muteness on the inside was merely speech on the outside. The assent of thought to this speech on the outside was merely ressentiment of the mood or the mute tonality. Nietzsche's declarations transferred the muteness of the mood onto thought, insofar as the mood came up against the resistance of culture from without. That is, the speech of universities, scientists, authorities, political parties, priests.
What?
Ray?
Okay. Or cash, no, man. Cash.
And you're muted. We'll unmute you at some point. I have no idea what he was yelling about either. I hope it wasn't me. Don't think it was me. This is this obstacle, this muteness that has been introduced. This is this weird virtual authority that we're going to be getting into in chapters 3 and 4. I think 3 and 4. Because the muteness, which is inability to articulate. Muteness is here again. Klossowski means these things quite literally when he's saying this stuff very much. The muteness, the inability to communicate on the inside was merely speech on the outside. There's dual characteristics across all of it, right? So it's not that this obstacle simply blocks teaching, but it actually calls into question the very purpose of philosophical pedagogy entirely. It puts the aim of teaching itself in question. That's the point that he's making. It completely fucks with the very idea of philosophy as it goes. And so what is happening here is this isn't an absence, not for Nietzsche, but it's actually an active force. Because again, for Nietzsche, he didn't really do the negative. Wasn't really his jam. He was pretty much a wholly affirming philosopher in my read of him and others, and Klossowski's for sure. And so as he's making his way through, it's the line, now the resistance of the mute obstacle was nothing other than the virtual reaction exerted by authorities of identity and reality. This is the thing, this virtual authorities. These are not authorities that sort of act through direct authoritarian censorship. There's very specific terms being used here that we're going to be coming to later. But instead, this is about sort of an internalized resistance. This is the structure of thought, the structure of thought itself that's sort of here. And the obstacle appears mute inside of this because it is this unspeakable power of institutional authority operating within consciousness itself. I actually have an essay I've completed that I'm recording tonight and editing hopefully tomorrow that's about the way that paternalism and maternalism operate from authority on high. There's a lot of things this has kicked clear for me, but the thing that you have to remember about how thought works is muteness as is being sort of exerted or shown here, or is having light cast upon it. This is the thing that Nietzsche's screaming about, sort of, or is being screamed around. This is the muteness, when we have people who teach us, however they may teach us, whether it's the paternalistic authority from on high, where you do this because I said so because I'm an expert, tends to be paternalistic. Even if it's maternalistic, which is someone from below, I'm helping you do the best thing because I care about you. These things, over time, and even right away, castrate your ability to have secondary connections or find your own, and in fact, create these sort of odd spaces of muteness. And this is what he's referring to here. It's an internalized resistance to things, to finding new paths, going into a new direction. And that challenge becomes exactly where Nietzsche's at. Nietzsche is new shit. We can't understand him. He's critiquing the things we're using to understand him with. And by doing so, we're basically trying to build a computer with rubber and wondering why the computer doesn't work. It's because it doesn't work. There's no electricity there, shithead. And you can't do these things because there is naturally in what Nietzsche's doing an incompatibility. Rudd says it shorter and better, as usual. Klossowski is saying Nietzsche cannot be understood as having new versions of old ideas, a negation of what already exists, but rather a positive push into what didn't exist before. Yes, it's, again, I fucking really, really love this shit. And so we run into these problems. And this is what Nietzsche is spending his time doing. Muteness on the inside, merely speech on the outside. What appears as this internal silence, or again, how do I refer to it? It's neutralizing pablum. Think of it as just a neutralizing palm. It is nothing. There's no echo off of it. It's nothing. It's this internal muteness. This blocks things from within is actually that authority from without. This is the idea of speechlessness or muted sort of characteristics, which again, we're going to be getting into. Nietzsche really loves that shit, is actually being overwhelmed by the speech of others. So the muteness internally is actually the speech of others overwhelming and creating that sort of neutralization. The assent of thought to this speech on the outside is the ressentiment of the mood or mute. I'm going to always say ressentiment, by the way, of mood or mute tonality. So this is fantastic. It reads better in French because if you read it in French, it would say the assentiment of thought to the speech on the outside is merely the ressentiment of the mood or the mute tonality. It works better that way because the thing he's playing with is that the assent, the rational agreement with this external authority is actually a reaction, a ressentiment-filled reaction with the muted mood or tonality. So ressentiment is the slave's poisoned yes to the master morality. Assent that masks ressentiment. A sentiment that masks ressentiment. I'm going to start saying a sentiment because it's cooler. I'm going to say that because it's cooler. Yeah, no. Smith's translation, just so you know, you're not going to hear me one time, like, pull up the French. I do pull up the French because it does read better, but he literally leaves in all of this shit where it's like again, Daniel Smith understands the importance of why these words were played out and how they're meant. Here it's intended to specifically talk about the assent versus resent, but it doesn't work the same way. So he makes sure that you get this is what Klossowski's playing with. And it's really important. It's super important the way that he plays with them. So to continue, in identifying himself with this mute obstacle of the mood in order to think it, Professor Nietzsche destroyed not only his own identity, but that of the authorities of speech. As a consequence, he suppressed their presence within his own discourse, and along with their presence, he suppressed the reality principle itself. His declarations were directed towards an outside that he had reduced to the silence of his own moods. Though they were reduced, and we're going to do both of these paragraphs together, I think. Yeah, I have got them together. There's a reason for that. In identifying himself with this mute obstacle of the mood in order to think it, sorry, that's the one I just read. His declarations were directed to an outside that he had reduced to the signs of his own moods. Though they were reduced to silence in Nietzsche's declarations, however, the speaking agencies had never been anything other than the configuration of his moods. The mute intensity of the soul's tonality could be sustained only as long as a resistance from the outside was still speaking. Culture. As a side note for Klossowski, Living Currency talks about a lot of things, but Klossowski writes pretty much constantly about the way that when we talk about social cachet, he means it much more literally, and he means it in everything, that all of the ways that we interact, all the things we do is actually the currency of culture. It's cultural currency quite literally being exchanged all the fucking time. And culture is those things that are constantly traded and played with and worked with. Francois Julien actually has, There's No Such Thing as Cultural Identity, fantastic little book about the nature of the resources of culture and how you can use them that plays off of this. But it's completely shifting the idea of what it means to actually be speaking, or how one can still speak with this muteness that is sort of played with. So he opens here and he talks about basically this weird moment of philosophical suicide. where Professor Nietzsche destroyed not only his own identity, but that of the authorities of speech. Nietzsche, by identifying this obstacle, which he didn't try to overcome it. He actually just tarried with it. He left it there. He kept it going. Nietzsche basically eliminated the expert persona, the academic persona that was sort of built into what he was doing. And also with that, the authorities, the concept of authorities, how authorities work that actually constitute his professional identity as a thing. It's not him playing with some external critique here. This is him very much dealing with his own professional identity as Klossowski sees it. It is him dissoluting everything and thinking the obstacle from within rather than against it. Yeah. And so by doing so, by seeing this thing and understanding what it is, Klossowski sees what Nietzsche did as not standing outside of it and critiquing or standing around, but instead going within, working within it, and basically obliterating it like Neo in Agent Smith in The Matrix, more or less, because it makes destruction mutual and necessary. It's fantastic as an interpretation. And again, I find it very convincing, to say the least. So as he continues, as a consequence, he suppressed their presence within his own discourse, which he really fucking did. And along with their presence, he suppressed the reality principle itself. The reality principle is this fundamental thing to psychoanalysis, to a whole bunch of different things, which is, hey, what is an inner fantasy versus an external constraint? The reality principle kind of is that governing thing. But because we don't have authorities anymore, right? Without that external authority that is the reality testing, discourse becomes imminent to movement. It's a complete break from everything before Nietzsche. This is a complete break. I think Spinoza does some of this, but Nietzsche's version of this, as Klossowski sees it, is wholly unique and completely different. And the reality principle, the Freud and Lacan very much played with, that is absolutely turned upside down and critiqued, and I think obliterated very well by Felix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze and Anti-Oedipus. Paul Virilio in Lost Dimension is another one who plays with this. But the reality principle and being within it and exploding it meant a mutual destruction. And it's kind of a really weird one because, as he writes here, his declarations were directed to an outside that he had reduced to the silence of his own moods. This outside had kind of been taken over by interiority. The external world became nothing but the silence of these affective states of mood, of, as I said, vibes or humor. This weird solipsistic take ends up becoming central to a lot of what Nietzsche did. It's communication becomes self-reflexive, self-affirming, but it still is addressable. It still is some level of formal structure. So this is not, as he says, an outside that he had reduced to the silence of his own moods. This is not absence. It's not that there's nothing there, but instead that it's sort of the muting of the external authority now, rather than the internal muting by shifting that. And how he did it is they were reduced to silence in Nietzsche's declarations. However, the speaking agencies had never been anything other than configurations of his moods. So the speaking agencies, these academics or authorities or all these other things, they're actually they're not actual external forces. There aren't any. Not for Nietzsche, not how Nietzsche sees it. They're all external forces, all of them, entirely. Which sounds weird, but that's basically the entire idea of internal and external resistance and external authority and muted internally was this philosophical theater that Nietzsche and others play out within a single consciousness, that Nietzsche was sort of extricating all of these things from. There was no actual authority doing things, but instead forces interplaying with other forces. Right? It's kind of a lot. But this is the projection of these things and the creation of these things. The way they're set up, there is not actually truly other, but instead the crystallization of those affective states taken as the delirium, taken as this thing that necessarily does exist. And that's why he's able to end this way. The mute intensity of the soul's tonality could be sustained only as long as a resistance from the outside was still speaking. Culture. So all of Nietzsche's philosophy, this mute intensity, he was referred to here now like a bunch of times, that for Nietzsche is kind of this authentic thought, the authentic expression of these things, and the presence of this resistance within culture maintains these things in tension without external authorities to push against. This tonal method loses gravity and intensity that is specific. So the Nietzschean critique kind of plays in a funny way here, and the way that this works plays in a very different way. It kind of, if it's successful, it won't survive its own success. Right? So as long as there's that resistance, it is almost parasitical, the way that Nietzsche's thought exists from the moment he stated it on. Because as long as resistance from the outside is still speaking, as long as culture is still there, this mute intensity of the soul's tonality will be sustained, which changes, just frankly changes, again, just so much about how I consider Nietzsche. And it makes a lot of some of the things he say makes, again, not just it's a preview, I guess, but I really, really fucking like this book a lot. Is how I'm rambling making sense here to people, or is it just ravings of a madman? One of the three categories, I guess.
Like the noise of culture, kind of like this kind of amount of the way of writing and the way of kind of speech, Nietzsche's speech, it's kind of like, I remember like in Human All Too Human, he critiques the French culture critic, right? And he kind of made fun of them, like, and it's kind of it's kind of an implication of kind of shutting down, right? Some cultural aspects and being like silent, right? This kind of silent internalizing kind of thing that puts you in a mood that is kind of outside the noise, right? The noise of culture, right? The noise of speech, I guess, right? And this is a very hard thing to do, I guess. But Nietzsche did it. This is a very hard thing to do.
He did, and it's someone in YouTube said, so we could say Professor Nietzsche's mute intensity of the soul's tonality could only thrive when it met resistance from the outside. Yes, and that's where Klossowski, again, this whole turn, because, and I've read a lot of Nietzsche until this, I don't know it. This is one of those things where it's like I actually can't understand how I used to understand Nietzsche, because this makes so much instant sense as soon as it's said, and somehow I didn't really grasp it in some. It's kind of fun, but to read the next paragraph, because it's exactly what you're saying. It's the next paragraph is exactly that. Culture, the sum total of knowledge, that is the intention to teach and learn, is the obverse of the soul's tonality, its intensity, which can be neither taught nor learnt. The more culture accumulates, however, the more it becomes enslaved to itself, the more its obverse, the mute intensity of the tonality of the soul, grows. The soul's tonality catches the teacher by surprise and finally breaks with the intention to teach. The servitude of culture thus breaks forth at the moment it collides with the muteness of Nietzsche's discourse. This is how good of a writer Klossowski is. Is the translation mute accurate? It's effectively accurate. Mute or moot, depending on how you want to use it in English, but it is generally speaking accurate. Yeah. It has a lot of the French word for mute has a lot of we kind of have this in English too, because it's a lot of the same roots, whatever, but it's like, oh, we can mute the TV, which makes it silent, but it's the being made silent, being muted. The person who's a mute, someone who has the inability to communicate, the world makes them so. Mute intensity is right. So it's the moment it collides with the muteness of Nietzsche's discourse, because Nietzsche's discourse isn't dialogical, almost. It's playing differently. And again, just to continue, since Professor Nietzsche's ultima verba turned into aphasia, it is easy for doctors to see this as confirmation of their own reality principle. Nietzsche went beyond the limits. He lapsed into incoherence. He ceased to speak. He howled or remained silent. No one sees that science itself is aphasic, and that if it admitted it had no foundation, no reality would subsist, from which it derives a power that induces it to calculate. It is this decision that invents reality. It calculates so as not to have to speak, for fear of falling back into nothingness. It's just so good. It's just so good. And that's the introduction. Before I move on, the ending here, just to mention, is I guess I did sort of signpost a little too clearly earlier. But a lot of people, when Nietzsche cracks up, because he does at some point, cracks up, and it's like the story goes that he was in Turin, saw a horse being whipped, and collapsed as he grabbed the horse, screaming, "What is it we do?" or the horror, whatever you want to say, and from then never spoke again, dying. And people go, "Oh, he peered into the void. He went too far. He did the thing. He went way beyond what the limits of things are supposed to be." And it's like, no, that's the problem. Is you're doing that. And his critique here is very Latourian. But it's the idea that if it admitted it had no foundation, science, no reality would subsist, from which it derives a power that induces it to calculate. That decision invents reality. It calculates so as to not have to speak, for fear of falling back into nothingness. It's so good. Nietzsche had chronic pain and syphilis. Nietzsche had, like everyone, I'm sure he had syphilis. That's, I think, been fairly talked about. But yeah, it's maybe he did. Maybe he did go mad earlier, Ben, and that's the point. And it's maybe okay.
Before you go, there's a word that I didn't know, probably because no one sees science itself is aphasic. What's this word?
Aphasia. Unable to talk, mute, basically.
Okay.
There's no articulable existence. It's kind of like mute. So he's saying that science itself is mute. That's the thing. And it calculates, it does all these things. It calculates so it doesn't have to speak. It's also aphasic. And that's kind of, so aphasia is at the end of his life. Nietzsche also didn't speak. Nietzsche's writings switch at one point and become a very, very different beast about how sort of he's going through these things. Yeah. So if that makes sense. Cool. The Turin horse story is probably false, but it did lead to probably Bellatar's best film, so I'm okay with it. If you haven't seen Bellatar's The Turin Horse, it is really, 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 really good. So I'll accept. I'm sure the story's not true. Like, it's too good of a story to be true, but it's a fucking good movie. So I'll accept it. All right. That was the intro. So that's him laying the groundwork for everything and how he's not only viewing Nietzsche, but wanting to take Nietzsche qua Nietzsche, taking Nietzsche as himself, not doing the psychoanalytic secondary sourcing that a lot of people do, taking the text for what they say and presuming what Nietzsche meant is what Nietzsche meant. And we're going to be doing that as we go through all of this. Now, there are things to be very ready for. He goes deep. There is words being referenced in this book and text being referenced where Klossowski goes, oh, and so in this letter that I found, that it's going to be that kind of thing where he just is pulling from a bunch of places and building all of this. And it's really great. So with that, I'm going to get myself some water. I'll be back in 2 seconds, everybody. So don't go anywhere. I need water, though. My throat's dry as shit now. Be right back. All right. Nope. And I'll just, Ronnie on YouTube adds a lot of the stuff that Klossowski's referring to, which for years has not been in English, is actually finally available in English. Stanford's publishing a bunch of that. So there's a lot of unpublished fragments. I think it's called the Unpublished Fragments. So there's some name like that. So.
I mean, there's like 5 texts of them or more.
Yeah, there's a bunch. There's a bunch. But Klossowski references a lot of them. It's going to be a whole thing, and it's going to be really interesting for us to go down roads. If anyone at any point wants to, by the way, don't hesitate to go, that's a road I want to go down. We will do it. But let's start the actual book. The Combat Against Culture. Culture, the generalized knowledge. Culture, knowledge. You'll see those earlier. It's going to be a big deal today. And a lot of what he's saying here, it's really applicable today. 1, because it's a multi-point thing. Is the philosopher still possible today? Is the extent of what is known too great? Is it not unlikely that he will ever manage to embrace everything within his vision, all the less so the more scrupulous he is? Would it not happen too late, when his best time is past, or at the very least when he is damaged, degraded, degenerated, so that his value judgment no longer means anything? In the opposite case, he will become a dilettante with 1,000 antennae, having lost the great pathos, his respect for himself, the good, subtle conscience. Enough. He no longer either directs or commands. If he wanted to, he would have to become a great actor, a kind of Cagliostro philosopher. 2. What does a philosophical existence mean for us today? Isn't it almost a way of withdrawing, a kind of evasion? And for someone who lives that way, apart and in complete simplicity, is it likely that he has indicated the best path to follow for his own knowledge? Would he not have had to experiment with 100 different ways of living to be authorized to speak of the value of life? In short, we think it is necessary to have lived in a total anti-philosophical manner, according to hitherto received notions, and certainly not as a shy man of virtue, in order to judge the great problems from lived experiences. the man with the greatest experiences who condenses them into general conclusions. Would he not have to be the most powerful man? For a long time, we have confused the wise man with the scientific man, and for even longer time with the religiously exalted man. Only now has it dawned on humanity that music is a cernological language of affects, and later we will learn how to recognize clearly the impulsive system of a musician through his music. In truth, he did not intend to betray himself in this manner. Such is the innocence of this type of confession, as opposed to every written work. I'm wondering how much I have to actually go back and explain of this, because this is actually pretty clear, mostly. Yeah, Cagliostro was a self-styled adventurer, magician. Someone on YouTube's just making sure we all know.
Does he reference Beyond Good and Evil?
Well, I mean, he's literally quoting Nietzsche here, so I'm hesitant if I want to even stop, because this is all Nietzsche. But like, all this is still Nietzsche. It's just broken into pieces. So it's they're kind of separate thoughts. The opening here, I probably should just go through the quotes. The opening here, the first bit, is Nietzsche sort of, again, as we talked about in the introduction, sort of taking the piss out of the idea of what it means for a person to have lived the right kind of life for being a philosopher. This, especially during his time there, and I mean, fuck, tell me that we don't do this now. Hey, how can you even comment on this if you haven't lived X, Y, and Z? You haven't lived a life that did X, Y, and Z, and yet you're that. Hey, how come you're a white man in Middle America writing about the African diaspora? These kinds of conversations presume this. Well, for a philosophical system and existence, we really demand that people have these sort of large, I don't know how to put it. We demand people have, that people have this wide lived experience, and Nietzsche's just skeptical of all these ideas that like presume the person needs to be in a certain place or have a certain kind of foundation in order to be that thing, in order to do that thing. We think it's necessary to have lived an anti-philosophical manner according to received notions, and not as a shy man of virtue, which is like really kind of weird. Philosophers, Deleuze writes about this too. People often see philosophers as these people who have withdrawn from society, that aren't really involved, and at the same time they're critiqued because they don't live and they don't do. So there's this we kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't mentality that Nietzsche's critiquing here, and then he kind of moves into sort of the setup of opening. The way philosophers, well, and I'll get through this. The opening here, as he's starting the second part, is continuing the same idea. He's saying it's only now that we have this understanding that music is a semiological language of affect, that the way that music and things in compositions operate is through cultural signifiers and semiotics in their own way, and that there is this impulsive system of a musician that comes through their music. This is how we see these things and we talk about these things. Beautiful music, as he says, later we will learn how to recognize clearly the impulsive. Someone is coming through very loudly. If someone who's a mod is in here, next time that happens, just mute them, server mute. So there's this weird thing with music that when we listen to someone's music and we sort of see them bearing their soul, we learn how to recognize clearly the impulsive system of a musician through his music, their style, their tone, their soul comes through it. We use this language. We fucking use this language actively, right? But as Nietzsche says, in truth, he didn't intend to betray himself in this manner. Such is the innocence of this type of confession, as opposed to every written work. He's going to be contrasting through this the way that philosophers operate or come through their work. So to continue, I'll get through the entire quote. We'll go back through it. Yet this innocence also exists in the great philosophers. They're not conscious that they are speaking of themselves. They claim it would be a question of the truth, when at bottom it is only a question of themselves, or rather, their most violent impulse is brought to light with all the impudence and innocence of a fundamental impulse. It wants to be a sovereign and, if possible, the aim of everything and every event. The philosopher is only a kind of occasion and chance through which the impulse is finally able to speak. God, Nietzsche is so good. There are many more languages than we think, and man betrays himself more often than he desires. How things speak, but there are very few listeners, so that man can only, as it were, chatter on in the void when he pours out his confessions. He squanders his truths as the sun does its light. Isn't it rather a pity the void has no ears? There are ways of seeing that make man feel, this alone is true and just and truly human. Whoever thinks otherwise is making an error. Ways of seeing we term religious and moral. It is clear that what is speaking here is the sovereign impulse, which is stronger than man. In each case, the impulse believes it holds the truth and the supreme concept of man. Undoubtedly, there are many men in whom an impulse has not become sovereign. They have no convictions. This, then, is the first characteristic. Every coherent system of a philosopher demonstrates that one impulse directs it, that there is a fixed hierarchy in it. This is what is then called truth, and the felt sensation can be described thus. With this truth, I am at the height of man. The other person is of a lesser kind than myself, at least in terms of knowledge. In rough and naive men, one conviction also predominates in their mores and even in their taste. They are the best possible. In cultured people, there reigns a certain tolerance in this respect, but one holds all the more rigorously to one's own criterion of good and evil, according to which one wants to have not only the most refined taste, but also the only legitimate one. This is the commonly reigning form of barbarism, that one doesn't even realize that morality is a matter of taste. For the rest, there is in this domain a maximum of imposture and lying. Moralizing in religious literature is the most full of lies. The dominant impulse, whichever it may be, resorts to ruse and lying to prevail over the other impulses. Alongside religious wars, there is always a moral war going on. That is, one impulse wants to subjugate humanity, and as religions gradually die out, this struggle will become all the more bloody and visible. We are only the beginning. That's fucking Nietzsche. Nietzsche's that fucking good. It's really good writing. Nietzsche's just really good writing. I just hope everyone agrees. Like, it's just really fantastic writing. I don't even feel I need to explain it. It's just so fucking clear, and I think it's very clear and crisp. Does anyone need it? I'm happy to. I just don't want to belabor time if everyone is getting it and being that kind of dick, because I just really think it's beautiful. Good. Because Klossowski's going to explain it. So that's, I believe that one's from Beyond Good and Evil. I actually think both of them are. Not positive, though. Not sure where the other one's from. But, It is Nietzsche. So, so to get to Klossowski. After all this, what then does the behavior of the philosopher amount to? Is he a mere spectator of events, at once lucid and impotent? Or, if all commentary is useless, will he have to intervene directly? But how can he make a direct intervention? Through analyses, declarations, warnings, or incentives? Does he have to win over people's consciences in order to provoke an event, breaking the history of humanity in two? Or rather, does not this event, which the philosopher apprehends the consequences of the disappearance of a unique god, the guarantor of identities, the return of multiple gods, first have to be mimed in accordance with the gestural semiotic of soothsayers and prophets? We must break with the classic rule of morality, which, on the pretext of realizing a human potential, makes humanity dependent upon habits adopted once and for all. Instead, we must behave in accordance with the strict demands that follow from relentless reflection. If a demand of thought can arise in an unforeseeable manner, it is because it can arise from behavior itself, thereby opening up that same behavior to the disparagement of a contradictory attitude. Behavior can never be limited by its regular repetition, nor can it limit thinking itself. A mode of thought that would restrict behavior, or a mode of behavior that would restrict thought, both comply with an extremely useful automatism. They ensure security. In reality, any thought that experiences the uneasiness of this provisional state reveals its own lassitude. By contrast, any thought that allows itself to be called into question, whether by an internal or external event, reveals a certain capacity for starting over. Either it retreats from, or it goes beyond, the statements made in the interval. It is on the basis of this lassitude, or this capacity, this retreating or going beyond, that Nietzsche will judge previous philosophers. Fairly accurate. A lot of fun words in there. There's a lot of stuff I think that's worth going over. I know someone was asking about the use of automatism. Someone had mentioned that earlier too. As we talked about in the intro, and I mentioned this idea of the authority, the external authority, the way that it's set up, the habits that we become dependent on, this muteness, all of these things. Klossowski's bringing up all of these things back in, and these are going to be ready for this over and over and over. The way that he's doing it is by talking about morality and using Nietzsche. Nietzsche did this a lot by talking about this sort of habitual dependency we end up developing because of it. There's this way that morality has a pretext of the goals that it's set up for, that it's going to make us have better lives. Like, honestly, that's really what it's about. It's, if you want to be better, if you want to have a better life, if you want to realize all your potential, blah, 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 blah. It's actually not for that. That's ostensibly what it's for, but it ends up creating this repetitive behavioral pattern that ultimately becomes this sort of temporal violence that we're going to see Klossowski going on about and on about and on about, because you foreclose future potentials because of these permanent habits in the now. Right? So as we sort of are existing, he says we must behave in accordance with the strict demands that follow from this relentless reflection. If a demand of thought can arise in an unforeseeable manner, it's because it can arise from behavior itself. This is, there's a lot said in this sentence. Behavior itself, action itself, and things itself can actually produce reactions, reflections in things. There's this odd feedback loop that gets created, especially when it comes to the way that we sort of find ourselves dealing with the potentials around us, the things around us, the way we're able to react with it, or unable to, that we completely foreclose on the entire possibility of it. So when we talk about foreseeable manner, and he's using the term unforeseeable, but give me a minute. The unforeseeable manner is one. Foreseeable is, well, we've planned for that. The habits, the morality gives us the ways we deal with this. But unforeseeable, well, this arises from specifically sort of systematic, experimental processes. And these genuine demands, I'll call them genuine, it's probably not the right word, but these demands that arise from the behaviors themselves or the forces themselves that aren't from the morality, this is actually the thing that can't be systematized, that can't be predicted, that can't be prepared for. And once that happens, he says, they're thereby opening up that same behavior, the disparagement of a contradictory attitude. So you have this behavior that has a thought that emerges, and then you have a self-criticizing natural dynamic that morality gives us, where behavior becomes vulnerable to its own contrary. This is the setup. The disparagement is not really a criticism, or you might even say it's not even like a rational, well, there's a bunch of reasons you shouldn't do that, let me give you those. But it's actually like a self-attack, an attacking thought that he's talking about, disparagement, where these actions turn against themselves. And through this, it kind of, it generates possibilities and the possibility space from there. And so again, this is this self-overcoming thing. This is will to power stuff that Nietzsche talked about. Again, we're sort of refreshing all of this stuff as he's going through it. But yeah, he then says behavior can never be limited by its regular repetition, nor can it limit thinking itself. A mode of thought that would restrict behavior, or a mode of behavior that would restrict thought, both comply with an extremely useful automatism. They ensure security. Automatism literally means the somatic automation of effective reaction. There's a psychological process of automatic reaction. Automatism is what he's referring to here. It was a thing that was diagnosed and began being used sort of early, what we might call autism, which they called schizoaffective disorder for a while. Again, these words become in time very difficult to sort of talk about. But automatism is repetitive behavior, automatic repetitive behavior. An automaton, like a robot that does it over and over, was a diagnosed behavior. Someone rocking or hitting their head against a wall, saying the same thing 900 times. This thing, this setup that sets up the challenge is that, as he says, behavior is not limited by regular repetition, nor can it limit thinking itself. It ends up this really odd thing. There's this external, extremely useful automatism, this thing that ensures security. And this is security through predictability, by automatically putting things in various categories, by automatically placing things in very specific spots. This creates the opposite, effectively, of authentic philosophical existence for Nietzsche. And this is going to be the thing, as he says, this is what Nietzsche is going to be judging everybody on. Because this capacity for renewal, this capacity for not demanding all be predicted, not all crushed in, all of this stuff is going to be a big deal. If that makes sense.
This gives me the representation of something that I watched a movie, in 2005 called Memento, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this movie by Christopher Nolan. And it's kind of like the nature of forgetting and at the same time categorizing things, right? And he categorized things and he categorized events where he write everything kind of in order. I don't know if that relates, but yeah.
Well, it does, because so he says the ending here and what he's going to judge, these philosophers on as he's talking about it, is I I should talk about lassitude because that's kind of the big deal. The lassitude is like finding a position that allows you to be sort of chilling and calm from like exhaustion. So like you lay down, you find a perfect position that your body doesn't have any tension with. You find the lassitude is like this exhaustion in fixed positions. That thing, it plays funny, right? The opposite would be this capacity for renewal that you can constantly be playing with. For Nietzsche, it's always about, ultimately, that philosophers are going to have a dynamic relationship with their own statements. It is not necessarily the systems they create. That's boring. And this is why Deleuze, when he and Guattari, when they talk about what is philosophy and they bring in the idea of philosophical concepts, they bring in the philosopher's friend, because the dynamic relationship that philosophers have with their own statements is the big deal. There's an interval with this that he's talking about where there's always a temporal dimension to what the philosopher versus their thoughts are. And what matters is ultimately whether thinkers retreat from or advance creatively beyond previous formulations when confronted with this. So it's kind of a physicalist, like kinetic criteria for how to evaluate people and talk about that, if that makes sense. And that's what he's going to be doing here when he's judging. I mean, it's basically a good summary, I think, of Nietzsche, to be frank. And here's a lot of bold statements. Enjoy this. A lot of bold statements here. Klossowski coming in with the hot takes. Neither Descartes, nor Spinoza, nor Kant, nor Hegel would have been able to construct their systems if, by some chance, they had renounced a teachable coherence in order to speak of existence from their own lived experience, though Descartes came close to doing so and seems to have concealed this intention. Nietzsche maintains that they have only complied with the secret concern to express the movements of their own moods. Quote, "They claim it is a question of the truth, when at bottom it is only a question of themselves, or rather, their most violent impulse is brought to light with all the impudence and innocence of a fundamental impulse. It makes itself sovereign and, if possible, the aim of everything and every event. The philosopher is only a kind of occasion and chance through which the impulse is finally able to speak." What then did Spinoza or Kant do? Nothing but interpret their dominant impulse. But it was only the communicable part of their behavior that could be translated into their constructions. What this means is that Nietzsche rejected, purely and simply, the attitude of philosopher-teacher. He made fun of himself for not being a philosopher, if by that we mean a thinker who thinks and teaches out of concern for the human condition. Nietzsche here acted ruthlessly, disruptively, and wound up achieving, one might say, a smashing success. Casse les baraques. It's a French joke. Nietzsche rejected any thought that was integrated into the function of thinking, because it is the least efficacious. For what are the thoughts and experiences of a philosopher worth if they serve merely to guarantee the society from which he comes? A society believes itself to be morally justified through its scientists and artists. Yet the very fact that they exist and that their creations exist is evidence of the disintegrating malaise of the society. And it is by no means clear that they will be the ones to reintegrate the society, at least if they take their activity seriously. Since Nietzsche was thinking and writing in a solidly bourgeois society, some 30 to 40 years before its first fractures appeared, his manner of seeing still seemed to conform to the initiatives undertaken by that same society. It is only today that we are able to measure the impact of his words and of his rejection. Bourgeois society no longer exists, but something much more complex has been substituted for it, an industrialist organization which, while maintaining the appearance of the bourgeois edifice, reorganizes and multiplies the social classes in accordance with the increase or decrease of ever more diversified needs, and which, because of its automatism, disturbs the sensitivity of individuals. I like this book a lot. Do I have to say that again? How many times can I say that? I'll say it a lot. I like this book a lot. I mean, they're just shitting all over a bunch of philosophers. I like Klossowski. I appreciate him. The utmost that Nietzsche criticizes is the civilizational and modernist totality, which appears only as an inclination towards intellectual vulgarity. Dogmatism in philosophy is merely delicate childishness and novice recklessness, as he says, but to him, this dogma has managed to dominate philosophy, making philosophy the site it perpetually inhabits. It manifests in the writing of philosophy's laborers, hence the bold statements. Fantastic. Afnan, love having you here. What Nietzsche meant to say through his own rejection of the system was that if philosophy merely concerns itself, I get to go to the second row of pages, look at that, merely concerns itself with the transmission of problems, it will never get beyond the general interpretation of a particular social state gives of its own culture. For Nietzsche, to make an assessment of Western culture always amounts to questioning it in the following manner. What can still be created from the acquisitions of our knowledge, our practices, our customs, our habits? To what degree am I the beneficiary or the victim or the dupe of these habits? With regard to contemporaries, with regard to his contemporaries, Nietzsche's own manner of living and writing and of thinking was the answer to these diverse questions. For Nietzsche, the moral question of knowing what is true or false, just or unjust, could now be posed in the following terms. What is sick or healthy? What is gregarious or singular? To quote Nietzsche, the first shoots of fecundity, insofar as they are a sign of health and promote vigor and resistance, initially have the character of sickness. This first explosion of force and will to self-determination is a sickness that can destroy humanity, and even more sickly are the first strange and wild attempts of the mind to adjust the world to itself, to its own authority. It seemed to Nietzsche, who was himself subject to valetudinary variations, constantly feared that his own thought showed the effects of his depressive states, that it would be equally revelatory to examine the forms of thought put forward by previous thinkers from the viewpoint of their relation to life, to living, that is, from the viewpoint of the rises and falls of intensity in all their various forms, aggressiveness, tolerance, intimidation, anguish, the need for solitude, or, on the contrary, the forgetting of oneself in the midst of the turmoil of an epoch. Nietzsche therefore judged morality to be the principal metaphysical virus of thought and science. Quote, I see all philosophers, I see science kneeling before a reality that is the reverse of the struggle for existence as taught by Darwin's school. That is to say, I see on top and surviving everywhere those who compromise life and the value of life. The mediocre dominate these surplus natures whose overabundance of life is a threat to the security of the species. There are therefore two powers, the leveling power of gregarious thought and the erectile power of particular cases. It's just, Klossowski's very crisp. I'm a big fan. Do I have to go over? I'm happy to go over stuff. Genuinely. I'll take a moment and let things be awkward.
Yeah, like Brooks, like Nietzsche therefore judged morality to be principles of metaphysics. Like the Darwin part is actually more important because Nietzsche kind of like mentioned Darwin and he criticized Darwin in Twilight of the Evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember, but like he said, like it's the theory. They misunderstand the theory. Like Darwin misunderstands his own theory, and it's about adaptation, right? He calls it adaptation. He has this Nietzschean word called adaptation rather than survival, right? Like an adaptation rather than survival, which is, you can find it in the Twilight of the Idols. I think in the untimely man, or untimely, the section like untimely man, I guess. Yeah, where he mentioned a couple of reference to our philosophers. So yeah,
This is Nietzsche's critique, like for Darwin, and he kind of the critique is kind of all over the place. But one of the things from my memory is that he's going over how people in Darwin misapply it to people, and he's kind of laughing. And it's one of the things he says is ultimately that like the people, and he's kind of saying it a little bit here, but he says it really clear that Darwin says the strongest, the best, the survival of the fittest is the one, but no, those who at the top for me, as I see it, are those who compromise life. Those who kneel before death, I think, is how he talks about it. The way that natural selection ultimately is reversed within cultural evolution is one of the ways that resentment and how he talks about it kind of comes to form. It's the reactive forces gaining ascendancy over active ones for Nietzsche, and it's a big deal for him, as I read it at least.
The reactive force is the partial restriction, right? The negative, the partial, what Deleuze in philosophy called the partial restriction, or the limit, right?
The limit, yeah, because we're talking about, and this is, but this is one of the things Bataille loved about Nietzsche, and you'll obviously see why. If you haven't read On Nietzsche, it's Bataille's book on Nietzsche. It's titled On Nietzsche. But the whole point for Bataille, as he's reading it, and I think Klossowski's pulling that, and I think a lot of people do, is that dominance is basically achieved by neutralizing surplus natures, surplus forces, things that cannot be necessarily handled. Deleuze and Guattari utilize this to talk about that there's no true desire can ever exist, or it would obliterate society. And that's kind of the big deal for him. He's like, hey, all this surplus energy, whenever it happens, it's immediately sort of, it's the thing that threatens stability. So if that's the case, then it's actually not the most powerful or the strongest forces, but it's actually the ones who are the most oppressive, the most dangerous, actually work the most, because stability for the group is actually what enables survival in that sense. More or less. Herd mentality being the dangerous thing. It's one of the big deals for him, as I read it again. If that makes sense. So it's tied to minor major dichotomy and
Here I go anti-anything.
Afnan tipped $4.20. Public are asking for longer reading sections. Smiley face emoji. Even if you just make the questions only in QC.
We're going to be doing 2-hour reading sessions. Maybe I'll do longer on the weekends. I'm not quite sure. We're going to play this one by ear. This book is a little different, and I've got all my notes for this book. Anti-Oedipus necessitates so much time on every paragraph that, one, it's nice to be able to read something that's not the case for. But two, it lets us get through a lot more and have bigger discussions and conversations, I think, about what Klossowski's saying in any given part or any given thing. And I think that's the part that's, I think, pretty interesting. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Is that fair? Yeah.
The reference about the habit, right, at the repetition, like Deleuze making, like, play with it in different repetition, right? And Nietzsche, like, played with it, right? And he mentioned in The Gay Science, right, that about the conservatives, right, who always doing this kind of thing, the kind of conservative who do, like, have a disapprobation, let's say, for for habit, right? Or for different habits, right? And it's kind of like Nietzsche kind of criticized this mentality of his conservative of his time about in the gay science, right? About the habit, about this kind of like about the people who kind of like have a kind of a disapprobation to habit or different behavior, different habits. I don't know how to phrase it, but yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I don't know what I can add to that. I don't think I can. Yeah, Afnan says, I want to see what your thoughts are on why Spinoza was mentioned too, although Nietzsche wants to. I think, like, again, I don't think in this passage, we're going to come back to this. So in this passage where he says, neither Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, or Hegel would have been able to construct their systems if by some chance they'd renounced the teachable coherence, that this isn't necessarily, I think, a takedown of any of these thinkers. I think instead it's what Nietzsche introduced and the thing Nietzsche introduced that then sort of became, again, that thing that had to be dealt with after him, which is a lot of what this is about within the vicious circle that we're going to be going through, that these guys were in that prior position. And they basically were writing with their impulses through this filter, the truth at bottom, the philosopher who's pushing through, that all of these guys came from that position, even though Descartes, as he says, though Descartes came close to doing so and seems to have concealed the intention. That's the push for him, that this is the thing they're doing. I think it works.
But Nietzsche did critique Spinoza. Like, he did mention him once positively, which is the one I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
He also mentioned him positively in another book, which is Man Thinking by Himself. But he did critique him. And I do think that it was about what Nietzsche hated, which is he called it disappointment. And he sees that there is sadness within the writing that Spinoza writes. And I don't know if you agree with that or not. But
no, I think that's fair. I think that's what Klossowski's bringing out here, at least as I'm saying, is they interpreted their dominant impulses, but it was only the communicable part of their behavior that could be translated into the constructions. And this is the thing that I think Klossowski's pointing out, is that, and he says it clearly, what Nietzsche rejected, simply, purely, the attitude of philosopher-teacher. And that to me rings in what I remember of his comments around Spinoza as well. But again, Spinoza, he was positive on, but again, he was shitting on the idea of how philosophers, what is it Rancière says that I love, philosophers and their poor, that philosophers always come here to help the unwashed masses, the hoi polloi, make their way through it. And that is like, really, guys? This is what you're doing? And he really, he attacked that pretty harshly. And I think that's what Klossowski's getting at least, again, maybe. That's an interesting one.
Quick question, like, does Nietzschean scholars expand upon the educational theory of Nietzsche?
I'm sure someone does. I'm sure someone has. Nothing off the top of my head.
Because 4 years ago, I read that Nietzsche as an anti-education or something like that. And it's kind of like a breath of fresh air. Like, there is a lot of kind of like he played with things. He played with kind of not dialectics, but he kind of have this dialogue, which is very interesting. Like, it's very interesting kind of dialogue about education in general.
Well, we're going to be getting into Klossowski's takes on that, and I kind of don't want to give previews because I don't think I'll be able to say anything but what Klossowski's about to say. at this point, for me at least. We'll see. Shall I continue? All right. Voice was suspicious when philosophers use health as a criteria to judge values. It's too vague, carries so many lies. Nietzsche's very clear in how he uses health and sickness. And he follows on. It's again, to talk about Spinoza. Spinoza does it first and builds out a system that I think Nietzsche just utilizes. After, would you disagree with that? Like it seems like it's almost Nietzsche does some cool things with it, but it's kind of a direct line. No? Eh. Fair enough. I should not demand answers. But health and sickness, these kinds of things, the way things work together and damage each other versus good and evil, it's a big deal. It's worth reading. It's good stuff. But specifically at the end of the paragraph, to be able to continue on, there are two powers. The leveling powers of gregarious thought, the herd instinct, the way at large, gregarious thought, at large we see things, that tends to flatten, remove vitality from the gregarious thought and the leveling power. And then the erectile power of particular cases, the singular instantiations of force and desire, libido, whatever you want to phrase, the impulses of things. The erectile power of particular cases. These are the two things, big deal to go with. This allowed Nietzsche to identify those metaphysical systems commanded by moralities whose only aim is to perpetuate the reign of gregarious norms and instincts. Any system that does not receive their approval cannot survive. But there also exist systems that are impracticable to the greatest number, and which are consecrated to a particular case, Heraclitus and Spinoza, and others that form a code reserved purely for a limited group. I have no clue. La Rochefoucauld. The metaphysics of Kant, by contrast, harbors a behavior that Nietzsche summarized in the image of the fox who returns to his cage after having broken out of it. This is Nietzsche. To construct systems in the very epoch where we see science beginning is pure childishness. In return, we must make long-term decisions regarding methods, for centuries. For one day, the direction of the future will have to pass into our hands. Methods, however, that themselves come from our instincts and regulated habits that already exist. For example, the exclusion of ends. But in Nietzsche's mind, these methods amounted to a reproduction of the very conditions that have formed and favored his vision of the world, and which therefore had given his type of feeling and thinking a chance of success. One day, these isolated cases will come into possession of their own methods for directing the future of humanity. Did Nietzsche believe in the efficacy of these methods, or rather, did he simply want to transmit the states of his own soul in order to make sure others would have the means of reacting and acting under the worst conditions, thereby enabling them not only to defend themselves, but also to counterattack? At the end of this first inquiry, Nietzsche posed a new question in the tone of voice that was completely foreign to all previous speculation. Who is the adversary? Who is the enemy to be destroyed? For the more thought can circumscribe its adversary, the more it can concentrate its strength. In determining the enemy, thought is able to create its own space, to extend it, to breathe freely. The enemy was not only Christianity, nor was it morality in itself, but a complex amalgam of the two. Philistinism is too weak a term, nor does bourgeoisism adequately describe the monstrous hydra, for it is made up of an extraordinarily diverse tendencies and deceitful practices. It is in all things and in each thing. And Nietzsche himself had to struggle to free himself from the enemy, to eradicate all its germs which he bore in himself like a hereditary sin. That was his first task. And that is the 2-hour mark. I'm not going to push myself too fucking hard because I really could just absolutely go fucking nuts and I could read this book for like the next month. Straight through 3 or 4 times until I had no voice box at all. 1 second. No, why would I want white? White's not even useful. There. For reading 2, we'll head out that way. Perfect. Every week we're going to be doing more of this and making our way through. As just a bit of a preview, most of this opening chapter is sort of going through how Klossowski reads Nietzsche. We're not quite at the point of actually the retelling of a lot of Nietzschean thought. We're seeing some of it already. If you can imagine, it gets a lot more wild. Chapter 2, the valetudinary states at the origin of the semiotic of impulses. Impulses is going to be a big push throughout this, and you'll actually start hearing me using it a lot more in some of my videos and essays, as well as when I talk about things inside of Anti-Oedipus, because there are talks where Deleuze, clearly after talking or reading this or talking with Klossowski, uses impulses or their version of it in French significantly. The impulses, the forces, the drivers. Valetudinary is an amazing, unique word. And it's going to matter a lot. And these are, again, to Gast, St. Moritz, 11 September 1879. I am at the end of my 35th year, the middle of life, as people for a millennium and a half have said of this age. And will say again, because everyone dies younger soon. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is where it starts to be super fun. The experience of the eternal return. And again, we go back to the writings to Gast and the nature of forgetting an anamnesis and the eternal return of the same, and the absolute shift in how I will forever read Nietzsche is this chapter. Yeah, valetudinary means related to health. It does. Weren't you already saying you're suspicious about health, and yet you know what valetudinary means? No wonder you're suspicious about health. You know too many words for it. But we will start here next week. It'll probably take us 2, maybe 3 weeks to get to chapter 3. This is not going to be a super long reading. I have no idea how it's going to go. And as we go, if you have ideas for ways that it could be improved or things that could be better, let me know. As I said, this is not going to be an anti-Oedipus reading. This is a much more conversational, much more open, and despite using words like valetudinary, it is actually a phenomenally simple read. So I'm excited for that. I'm excited for more. Those of you on YouTube, I want to thank you. Those of you here in Discord, please, thank you too. If you want to join us in Discord live and scream at me like nobody did here, please feel free. Head over to discord.gg/DGQC. If you like what we do, head over to Patreon, patreon.com/DGQC. A couple bucks if you can afford it. Makes a huge difference in my world. This is going to be a milestone for me this month. We're actually going to make maybe around $1,000. Which is crazy to be able to have. We're not quite at the point where I can support a family on it and I can stop doing other things, but it's amazing. The number of people who've been coming via YouTube, the way we've been seeing stuff grow, and the people who've been joining us more and more that we've been finding. And I look forward to finding many, many more people. And so with that, I look forward to it. I'll be streaming this weekend. Tonight, I'm going to be finishing up my essay for tomorrow and then next week. So there's a couple essays coming. It should be fun. Should be fun. Should be fun. A lot of pop culture shit, but I think fun. So we'll see what happens, but who fucking knows? I guess, till next time though.